Hi everyone, so I'm going to go straight into how I do resin casting. First of all, I prepare the molds by using mold release. I tend to prefer this spray, and what they recommend is you do a thin layer and you use a brush just to kind of break it up, just get all into those little details there. I tend to use mold release because it does help get the resin out, but it's not always necessary. Once I've done that, I'll do a second layer, just a thin layer on top. You don't want to overdo it because it can leave a bit of a residue if you do too much. I don't do it necessarily for every single cast, but I might do it every few. I leave it for 5 minutes after the second. I then do the second stage. Again, you don't have to do mold release or this talcum powder. So I use a cornstarch talcum powder, but some people just use cornstarch and some people just use normal talc, but I just kind of use like an in-betweeny one. Basically, the reason that people use this kind of powder on the surface is to break up the surface tension. So the bane of all casters is air bubbles. And no matter how much you try to mitigate the air bubbles, you can sometimes still get them, and this helps burst the bubbles on the surface. It also helps the resin get really into those details. So a lot of people do favor using powder. Now, the reason that I do use it as well is because I tend to do white pieces. So like I usually use a resin that cures white, but I don't recommend using powder if you're doing kind of like a clear cast, because you can actually see it. So yeah, just if I would avoid it if you do that. If you do a clear cast, maybe only use the spray release, or sometimes some people don't even use it at all. I just find that using a combination of the spray release and the powder does extend the life of the molds, and silicone is so expensive. So anything that increases the molds is good. So you don't want to have too much talc on there either. So you could see that I was patting it off, so it just leaves that tiny little thin layer, just enough to keep on it, but not enough to like distort the shape. And the next stage is to close the molds up. So I have two different kinds of molds. The two on the right are 2-part molds, and this one is a 1-part, so I have to cut it open to do it. And as you can see, I put like really big wavy lines, and these are what you call keys. So in the 2-part molds, they're those bumpy bits, and then here it's that wavy cut. It basically helps the silicone stay together. If you don't do that and it's more straight, actually silicone can slip quite easily, and then you'll get like weird lines when you do casting, and it's really hard to stand out. So when mold making is a completely different tutorial. So yeah, definitely check out my other videos for those. But yeah, on here I try to line it up, even though it does have large cuts in it. It definitely still needs checking to be lined up. Most casters I know tend to use these like really thick, wide rubber bands, because basically it helps spread the tension across the surface. If you use just like a thin rubber band, it will basically pull onto the surface. However, I'm using a little rubber band here just on top, because I find that if I do a pour where it has a large flat bottom, if it pours over the side, then it just like flows out, and then too much resin gets lost. So actually this just helps it not just all pour down the side. Now with this long piece, actually you can see the normal size rubber band is a little bit too tight, and it forces those bits in the middle apart a little bit, and you really don't want your mold coming apart, because then resin can definitely leak out when you pour it. So I actually make custom size rubber bands. They are definitely not pretty, but they definitely get the job done. And it will save you the heartache of trying to find the perfect length rubber band in a shop, because actually it can be quite tricky. They tend to come in quite standard sizes. I also put a rubber band across, because actually it's the middle bit on a long piece like this is most likely to come apart. So you really do have to make sure that it's held together firmly, but not too tight. Because if also another reason you don't want it on too tight is that it can distort the inside of the mold, and you really don't want that either. Another thing to look out for is a mistake that I make right here. So when I did this originally, I accidentally put the rubber band over the top of the hole, the vent. That is where the air escapes. So the problem is if you don't allow that to have the space open, it can basically trap the air inside, and you really don't want that. That can really mess up your pour. So when you put the rubber bands on, you're always checking to make sure that the mold is as nicely together as possible, and keeping all vent holes clear. And you also want to make sure that the tension of the rubber band is fairly similar all the way around. So that's the preparation of the mold. And we come to the mixing portion of the casting. So safety is very important in casting, and I really recommend everyone get a respirator with chemical filters. And what I'm doing there is I just did a little test, and yes, it's fine. Now, on the wall here, you will be able to see that I've put up a bunch of numbers. And the reason is because my preference is to actually weigh the resin parts. A lot of people like to do it just the 1-to-1 volume using 2 cups, but I like to weigh it, and I'll show you why. But before I go into that, it's very important that you mix up parts A and parts B before you even mix them together. Because if you leave them sat for a while, they can actually separate inside, so that means that the chemicals aren't correct. So you need to mix them up first to make sure that the chemical is thoroughly stirred before you even do that. I like to weigh the pieces for a few reasons. Well, first of all, I do find that if I don't get the chemical ratio correct, that I sometimes can have problems. Not everyone has problems, but I'd like to eliminate that. So I'm very finicky and I weigh it. Not everyone is like me. I'm pretty particular, but the one thing that this does help, it helps waste in 2 different ways. So first of all, it means that I don't need to get 2 different cups to do my leveling and to pour them in and out of each other. So this means that I can just pour it straight into 1 cup. And the second part is that I know exactly how much each cast is going to need. So that way, not only can I work out the cost, which is the second main reason, I can work out the cost of each one to cast, and thirdly, I'm not wasting resin, because that is a problem, that if you're just measuring it, if you're just doing the 1-to-1 ratio, I found that I wasted a lot of resin. Some people have I don't know what people call them, but they have an extra mold that they have on the side where they just put the unused resin in it so that they're not wasting it completely. But I would rather just use the weighing methods to kind of take away that part. So now we get to pouring the second part. Because it has such a short cure time, I use Smooth Cast 305. It only has a pot life of 7 minutes, but in Singapore humidity it's more like 6. I find that I really have to time myself. So the moment that I pour the B into A, I put the timer on. So I guess the thing is that everyone has different preferences to their pot life. I know plenty of people that are very, very happy to use Smooth Cast 300 or equivalent, and that has a pot life of 3 minutes. However, living in Singapore, it's very hot and humid, and these factors really speed up the chemical reaction in a way that makes me feel very uncomfortable, because it might seem like this is a very calm process, but actually you have to really concentrate. So I find to do everything I need to do, I definitely need that 6 minutes of pot life. I have very often got carried away before I started using a timer mixing, because you can get really paranoid about it not being mixed together properly. So you have to make sure it's thoroughly mixed, and then you have to scrape the sides of the cup, and you have to make sure you get down into the bottom of the cup as well. And so like it might look like a really calm process, but you're just kind of like, oh no, is it mixed? Maybe, maybe not. But usually I give myself a cut-off time. So if I can't go over that for mixing, and I just have to kind of, hope that I've done it well enough, and, then I tend to put it into a vacuum chamber. Now, not everybody does this part of the process, but I find that it works really well for me, and it was a habit I got into before I even had a pressure pot. So the vacuum chamber, what it does is it sucks all the air out, making it so that the bubbles end up being very large. They get bigger and they pop at the surface. So it's kind of trying to remove the air from the mixture in a kind of way that like makes it all pop on the surface. And then what you just saw then was a collapse. And I know it's really hard to see through this lid. I'm really sorry. It's so used and scratched up now, but yeah. So it what happens is once it collapses, where a majority of the air bubbles have popped on the surface, then I kind of take it out. But you have to be very careful, because especially with fast cure resins, I try to do this part as quick as humanly possible. I don't even necessarily get up to full pressure. So I do definitely keep an eye on it. Don't leave it. If you keep going and you fill the cup too much with resin, sometimes you have to let the air out a little bit. To let the air back in a little bit, so it can drop a little bit, and then keep doing it. Otherwise you'll overflow. So once you get to this part, the pouring, I tend to do the big molds first, so the ones with the big holes at the top, because it's just quicker just to get it all done as quickly as possible, and it gives it more space for the air to rise up. And then second, I'll do the slightly smaller ones. Now the smaller the hole in the top is, which is the sprue, the slower it is for it to actually pour into the hole and to get into all the detail. But you don't want to do it too quickly, so you can see how slowly I have to do it at times, and then it just kind of pours in, and then sometimes you have to double check to make sure there's not air in there. So I'm doing what some people call burping. So I burp and I tap it. So that as you can see, actually there was some air trapped in there. So I just top it up a little bit. Now, if you can see the vent holes on the side, you can see that there is a little bit of resin in the vent holes. So that to me indicates that actually it is at the top, which is good. Sometimes I rub the air off the top if it's a flat piece, but normally it's not that necessary. I just did it because I didn't pour it that well, because obviously I'm on video and that's when I poured it the worst. So yeah, I'm just topping it up. And yeah, I have no idea how people do this in 3 minutes. Like even just pouring it in can be a nightmare. But yeah, depending on how you've made your molds, can really depend on how much time it takes to even pour the resin into the pieces. Now, I'm placing them carefully into a pressure pot. So the pressure pot does the exact opposite of what the vacuum chamber does. And instead of making the bubbles bigger, it actually crushes the bubbles very, very small. But that's why you have to leave it in the pressure pot the entire time that it's curing. So it actually cures with the bubble very small. So that is why a lot of people love pressure pots when they do resin casting. A lot of manufacturers of resin might say in the description that you don't need a pressure pot. But in my experience, in my humble opinion, is that if you use a short cure resin, I do often find that without using a pressure pot, I will definitely have lots of little air bubbles all the way through the cast, regardless of whatever mitigating process I've tried to do before. So here I'm attaching the hose to the pressure pot, switching on the compressor. Then I open the hose at the bottom and then open the hose at the pressure pot. And now the pressure is starting to go in. The kind of compressor that I have has the full tank goes in straight away, but it's quite small, so it can't fill the 10-litre pressure pot that I have like completely. So then it has to switch on. It takes a little bit of time. But since it gets up to 40, and the pressure that you need for resin is about 40 to 60 anyway, so I tend to err a little bit on the higher pressure, but I know plenty of people that use 40 and are fine with it. I think it really can depend on the kind of resin you're using and your environment. I've just found that a little bit closer to 60 works for me. So once it gets up to 60, you basically just have to leave it in. Some people remove the hose. You don't, as long as you close the valve so that it doesn't, so that the air doesn't escape. But I tend to leave the hose in, because if the pressure pot hasn't been closed exactly 100%, you might get like a tiny leak somewhere. So by keeping the hose attached, if the pressure drops, it will introduce more pressure just to kind of top it up a little bit. So that's why I tend to leave the compressor and hose attached the entire time it's curing. But you don't have to. It basically just is what works best for you. Smooth Cast 305, what I currently use, has a pot life of about 7 minutes, but more realistically 6, so I did really push the time this time. And it tends to cure for demolding purposes for about 30 minutes, but I usually set about 35. So here I close it up again, and I close it at the bottom, and then switch it off. And I do this for safety. And I just trying to get into a good habit of making sure I do the same thing every time. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo the valve. And actually this part takes such a long time, so I'm going to edit this bit out like magic. So yeah, so I tend to try and open it as quietly as possible, so not to disturb my neighbors too much. And then, yes, just slowly let the pressure out. And there we go, we've already got down to 0. I just make sure that the air is completely out. And then before I open the pressure pot, I do tend to just close the valve and close the hose valve as well. This makes it ready for the next time I pour, because when you're pouring, as you see, you're thinking about so many of the things that I try to make sure that it's okay for the next time of use. So that's just another thing I don't have to think about. One thing I will definitely say about pressure pots and compressors is that I don't like to give advice about them, because they are no joke items. Every country and regions will have different rules about pressure vessels. So I really advise that you find specialists in your own area, and make sure you do the research before you purchase anything. But if you safely, then they're great. So obviously safety is always paramount in casting. And so the piece is now ready for demolding. Unfortunately, it is not the end of the process, because I have to take it out, clean up the pieces a little bit, ready for sanding. So I am going to show you some of that process. I'm also going to show you a little bit of analyzation. So for example, if you can see up in the foot there, the resin actually dips a little bit, because I find that the surface tension of the mold, if it doesn't have enough resin at the top in a well, like so for example I use that red rubber band to kind of give me a little bit more resin space, like kind of like a lip, I guess. In this case, unfortunately, the resin kind of came out of the rubber band, so it left a little bit of an indent. The only way to get rid of it really is just to sand it down, and I do find that sometimes I just have to do that. The alternative way of doing it is to build into your mold like on a slight platform, or like give it a little bit extra well to have extra resin in there. But the reason that I tend not to do that is because when you're at home and you don't have like fancy equipment to like sand it down by machines, I find that it just takes so long to sand down the bottom. So the least I can sand down the better. But unfortunately, sometimes I occasionally not do a super great pour, and like especially if it's not like totally even inside the pressure pot when it's curing. But yeah, you can see how on the edge here it dips down a bit. But it's not like the end of the world. You can see that actually the bottom indicates that there aren't any bubbles, and it's a pretty bubble-free cast, which is always a victory. You should always take the small victories. So I'm now taking out the tail part. This is a 2-part mold, and halfway through making the mold, I kind of changed my mind. That's why it kind of looks a bit funny shaped on that part I just took out. There you can easily see the vents, and I've just pulled out a little bit of flashing. So the parts between the molds where they join, the resin gets into all the nooks and crannies so well that you can even get between the mold parts, and it just causes this very, very thin piece of plastic. But they call it flash. It's really easy just to remove with your fingernails, just like this. I mean, there's many, many different ways of removing it, but yeah, I just usually, once I take it out, I just quickly get rid of it. I'm not doing it like a super great job on camera, but yeah, but the point is that it's very, very easy to remove. The next stage is just to remove the vents and the sprue at the top where you pour into. So I have 2 sets of pliers, and this one is better for just getting the majority off, but they aren't very accurate. So sometimes when I use them, they can slip down a bit and they can damage a sculpt. So I try to cut a little bit higher because I have done that in the past. So yeah, you just have to kind of be really careful. It kind of flings everywhere, as you can see. And then what I do is I'll get the more precise pliers just to get it off. So that's the green ones that are on the table. And then, yep, just a little bit of more accuracy, but I'm not going to show you all on camera. It's fine, no problem. You get the idea. Now with this, with the wings, I absolutely love demolding these, and you can see there are the vent holes, and there's another one as well. If you see that the resin has cured and you can see it in the vent holes, that's usually a really good indication that there hasn't been any major air bubble traps. So for me, that's always a good sign. I like to see that when I pull it out of the pressure pot. The wings are a very detailed sculpt, so I always try and open these very carefully because silicone, it doesn't last. The more and more you cast in it, the more and more it can degrade. So trying to respect the mold is the best policy, and especially pieces that have a lot of detail. It does require some delicate handling, and even after a while, even if you're really careful, you might still see that some of the details come out. They get like ripped off the more and more you do it. But yeah, if you can be careful opening the more detailed aspects of your molds when you're pulling a cast, it's always better. And that actually came out really beautifully, if I must say so myself. I was really happy with how this came out, and you can see here and here, but this particular mold, I actually added these vents in extra because in the past when I was doing it, it was very susceptible to getting a bubble right there, because when you pour in, the place that you pour, if it's not a very big vent, it can actually cause air pockets to be trapped in that area. So sometimes it's fine, but sometimes you just need to add it in afterwards, and I just get a knife and just literally cut vents into the mold itself. So sometimes I actually put wire in there when I'm making the mold, especially if I know it definitely needs to be there, but that time, yep, I've cut that one in with a knife. That's why it looks a little bit more rugged. But yeah, so you just flex it a little bit and it helps it get out. There's a reason that when we're designing molds, we try to avoid the detailed areas. So here I purposely put all the vents and sprues at the top of the wing because it was actually much easier to sand off. I try very, very hard to avoid putting the seams and the vents in places that are difficult to sand down, because like basically you'll sand off detail and you don't want to do that. And even in this place, I would say that it was quite complex to put the the seam all the way around the bottom of the wings because it's quite hard to get the flashing off in between, as you can see. So sometimes I utilize a toothpick, and even then it needs to be taken off more when I'm in the sanding stage. So often when you are doing casts and mold making, you have to make quite a lot of compromises. But yeah, at this stage it doesn't really matter if you get everything off or not. Oh yeah, just dropping it, there we go. As long as you just get most of it off, and I tend to prefer taking at least the vents and the sprues off, because in some cases the sprue is very big. I even need to use a saw sometimes because it's so large and I can't do it with pliers. But I find that once you do it closer to demolding, it's still a little bit softer. But once it's fully cured, it becomes much harder and brittler, and it is much harder to remove these things. So I actually prefer doing the majority as soon as I demold them. I've seen people use many different kinds of methods to remove flashing and to remove vents and things like that. So people can use knives and power tools. I think it just ends up depending on your personal preference and what works for you. And just like everything else in this video, there is many different ways to achieve the same thing. So this is just how I do it. I'm sure you all will find a way to do it in a way that works for you. I think I've done enough to at least to be able to show you what it looks like in the end. Oh, it's messy work, isn't it? So even when you are quite good at mold making, that you can't, seams are always going to be there. Like, that's why I try and make the seam at the back in a lot of cases, especially with these larger areas like this. If the mold isn't exactly together, you get this kind of slight slipping of the mold, and getting rid of that seam, the worse your mold is, and in terms of like the way it fits together, the bigger that seam is going to be. And I do find that with large flat areas like this, where that it's even more obvious. So yeah, the only way to get rid of it is to sand it. If you can do a mold that doesn't require any seam and you can actually pull it out, and there aren't that many situations where that's possible, is great. So if you can do that, but yeah, most of the time I have to have a seam somewhere. So this is my character Oxonlox, and yeah, that's how I cast it. So I hope that's been helpful for some of you. Thanks for listening to me for such a long time, and happy casting. All right, bye.